far more intricate in that regard. But I think with that said, and talking about working so much on a single game, I think that gives us a good segue into our first big topic. And I want to talk about this idea of finishing a game. And I'm sure everybody watching this live record right now who have done indie or their own or a work in a studio in terms of development knows that kind of challenge of knowing when to end a game and when you just want to go and do something else. And we're seeing more of this situation when it comes to the independent space, especially with games that go the full early access and crowdfunding route. We're talking pre-Kickstarter to a successful Kickstarter to then going on early access and then spending months if not years on a single title. And as we've talked to developers about, it can be very hard to continue working on a single game. We just did a who did we just talk to on the we just did a Perceptive podcast where they developed. Oh, I know, when we spoke to Trayvon, which for those of you watching this recorded right now or live will probably be last week. But he's been working on Bullet Mayan Warfare officially since 2015. His original idea started in 2012, and he still has plans for work on the game for another year. And when we talk about game cycle or development cycles that hit the multi-year trend, it can become very soul-crushing to continue working on a single title. And the news piece that kind of inspired us, again, is from Dodge Roll, who made the game Enter the Gungeon, which they have announced last week that they are not going to continue working on the game in the form of a paid expansion, and instead they're going to be focusing on a brand new game. Now, Enter the Gungeon was released, if I actually can type, was released in 2016. So we can assume that they obviously had to work on the game before then. So it must be at least, at this point, 3 years in terms of total development, maybe more than that. And from the news piece that they put out, they said that the wear on the team was so strong that they were even planning on taking a year off after the original, their first DLC, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so according to their piece, they've been working on this game for nearly 5 years now, so they must have spent some time in the prototyping and pre-production stage. And again, when you start to work on a game for that long period of time, curious to see if anybody has said anything on their forums about it. Let's see. No, there haven't been any posting. I was surprised that nobody said, angry things to Dodge Roll about the game. No. So either the audience is very accepting of it, or they may have buried it, or it could be a combination of the two. But it's very hard, I think, especially for the community, to understand when developers have had enough. Earlier in 2018, we saw this with Stonehearth, and developers wanting to move on after working on the game again for a good 5 years. And that community was not as accepting. Now, with that said, though, it's important to note the difference. Enter the Gungeon is a completely finished game. The DLC was a bonus, as well as what they were planning for a second piece. Stonehearth, however, was a game that was still being developed. There was still content that was promised through Kickstarter and Early Access that will never be in the game unless modders decide to add it. And a lot of people were very upset with them about that. As another point, with the game Battle Brothers, which Battle Brothers was released, I think that was last year, I want to say. Let's see. Yep, Battle Brothers was released last year, and developers said they didn't want to work on the game anymore, and so much fan outcry convinced them to work on an expansion, with Beasts and Explorations due out... Is that right? It's actually due out next week. we may actually want to go back to look at that one. But this was a case again of the developers wanting to do something else and being convinced by their fan base to keep working on it. And it represents a very interesting push and pull. Because as we've talked about before with post-release support and that never-ending hole that you can keep digging yourself into with it, that on one hand, if you release more content for a game that everybody loves, you could earn more money with it. But on the other hand, if people aren't buying your game or the sales aren't there, you can easily sink a project that was already maybe a minor success with post-release work. Because again, when you work on a game, that costs time and money that you could be putting towards another project or something more profitable. With something like a Cultist Simulator, for instance, the game has earned, from what Alexis was talking about, it has earned back its development costs and more. And it has been considered a success for the studio, and they have been working on post-release support. They have, I think, a good year or 6-month project schedule for that game. Let's see. The first DLC was released in August, and I think the next one is due out in a few months. Let's see. They released an update a few weeks ago. New expeditions, new work. There's going to be another bit of paid DLC. They're aiming their next DLC for that game in January. So that is definitely a case of a game that they are doing work on. And they did say, when they announced the post-release support, that this is all tentative, that they're not promising they're going to work on this game for 2 years in terms of more content. They said basically as long as there's interest and they're able to continue that work. And I think that's a very good contrast to just saying, I'm going to work on this game for the next 7 years no matter what happens. And like I just said, you can easily get into trouble with constantly trying to chase that dream success for your game. With something like Brigador, for instance, when Hugh Monahan talked about that when we did that podcast, he said that with the original release of that game, are you talking in general or for Cultist Simulator, Mike? With the original release for Brigador, it did not do anywhere near as good as what they were hoping for. It was a failure for all intents and purposes. And working on the Up Armor edition was a way of trying to get a second launch for that game. And from what he's saying, it did succeed. It did earn them back a lot of goodwill, and they got more sales from it. The same goes for Sky Shine's Bedlam with what was it? Oh no. What the heck was that name for the Sky Shine's Bedlam edition? Well, that was easy. I think it was just called the Deluxe Edition for that game. Or, I'm sorry, Redux. That's better. And that was them trying to make that game a lot more interesting, make it more sellable. But when we did those plays of it, I kind of felt that it was, I hate to say this, but it kind of felt like we were in a sinking ship situation where even the work that they were going to do for it, I don't think it was going to be enough to get people interested in playing that game. Now, getting back to Mike's question in terms of DLC, let me see, I'm going to do another quick look here. Usually when we talk about DLC related content, I've seen it between usually on the cheap end $3 to $5, on kind of the quote unquote premium end $10, and then when we talk expansion level content, that's usually $15 to $20. Let me see. And if we're talking about DLC and post release support, let's see what's going on with Stellaris. Let's see. So Species Pack were around $8. Story was around there. and then their expansions were about $20 there. Now, time playing, I don't know, and I think it depends on the DLC in question. Some people release DLC that's maybe like an hour or two of more content, like we saw with, what was it? Little Nightmares. There we go, it came to me. And then we have stuff like XCOM, where the DLC integrates into the main campaign, and that can easily be a 20 to 30 hour long play. Or you have something like The Binding of Isaac, where again, a single playthrough is only 40 minutes long, give or take, but the DLC adds more to that experience, and at that point, you never know how much value you're really getting out of it. Now, with XCOM 2, though, keep in mind that that expansion was released at $40. And looking at it, they added a lot. Like, Firaxis is definitely one of the... Firaxis and Paradox are probably two developers who really do DLC extremely well. When you look at Civilization, for instance, which I can't seem to spell today. No, it's on sale for $16. Yeah, when you're looking at their expansion, not their packs, but the actual expansions, they're priced at between $30 and $40. Let's see. And when they go that route with Civilization, it's never just adding in more of what's there. That's always a part of it, but they will always add in new game systems. So let's see. So we have new leaders and civilizations. Again, that's standard. There's going to be new consumable resources and powers. They're going to be adding environmental effects. And apparently there's going to be a World Congress in the game now as well. So with that, again, they are going with a massive change to the game. And when you have DLC and post-release support along those lines, it definitely adds more value to your game, to the point that for a lot of people, it almost comes down to, if you just buy the base game, you're only getting maybe half or a quarter of the experience. With XCOM 2, for instance, anyone who's played that game knows that War of the Chosen, at this point, is a default. It does so much to that game that a lot of people can't see playing the game without it. But, again, they didn't just work on that in a 3 to 6 month period. That was, I think, at least a year, maybe more of development, trying to get that to that point. And again, when we're talking about Firaxis and major studios, they obviously have more money and backing to do a game like that compared to an independent studio. And when you do, and at the independent level, it can become risky to keep working on that game unless you know for sure that people are going to play and that people are loving it. And this is why it's very risky to always keep developing post-release support, because as we said earlier, it's a double-edged sword. Some developers and consumers see it as, we're going to make a game that was good and we're going to make it better, and you're going to buy that and ideally earn that money, that development cost back and more. Some people will release post-release support as a way of saying a thanks to the fans, but then you're basically cutting into your profits. And the plan is either to reward fans who support you, or make that base game so appealing that people would be crazy not to buy it. But I think that's a very risky strategy, because you're assuming that people know about your base game and they love it enough to keep playing it and to keep getting the word out. But with stuff like Skyshine's Bedlam's case, and even something like Brigador, you have to wonder how much the additional work was really going to impact that game. With Brigador, it seems like it has done a lot. It spread a lot of goodwill, it got the word out, and people kept buying it. But I don't know how well it did with Skyshine's Bedlam. And it can also be a way of you, again, you're making a situation that was already on the bad side, making it worse by sinking more costs and development into a project that isn't going to recoup it. So, for people watching this live now or recorded, here's my question for you. Do you like it when a developer promises like year to 3 years of more support on a game? Or would you rather see them work on a new project? Because we've seen developers try to have it both ways. Clay, again, has been working on Don't Starve now for several years, but that's just a small part of their overall studio. They are working on additional projects like Oxygen Not Included, Hot Lava, and that RPG-based game. And some companies, again, have the freedom to do both. Blizzard is another one. Who knows how many projects they have in the pipeline? As the infamous news piece are talking about how everybody's trying to make a mobile game went over really well with their audience. But when we talk about smaller studios, like 2 to 5 people groups like that, it can become very hard to focus on everything like that. Again, I think Coldest Simulator is maybe like 2 people working full time, and then the rest are freelancers. And you gotta worry about, again, how much to do that. For me, I'm definitely I like to see new projects, but on the other hand, I've played games where I wanted to see more out of it. On the grab bag, we played through Forced Showdown, which was kind of a roguelike meets game show meets CCG in a very weird sense, and I loved that game. I thought that concept had a lot to offer, but as soon as that game was done in 2016, the developers decided to go and do Minion Masters, which is a free-to-play Clash of Clans style game. Wow, wait a minute. Yeah, I mean, the second they finished Alaska, that game, Force was released in March of 2016, and Minion Masters was released in December. So, I mean, they went fast into their third game. And, oh god, it's still in early access, too, with a planned release in the first quarter of 2019. So, what's left to do? And again, that was a case where it looked like there was a lot of potential for that series. The Binding of Isaac would be, I think, the opposite of Minion Masters, where that game was done. They could have moved on to something else, but they kept releasing expansions, and those expansions have grown the Binding of Isaac exponentially. And again, some games, I think, really do offer a great canvas for DLC like that. A story-driven game like Life is Strange, or a linear game like Trine or Shovel Knight, it's a little bit harder to get that value out of it. But when your game is built on roguelike or procedurally or randomly generated content, DLC can really go a long ways towards giving that game even more to do. And I think people are more accepting of buying DLC for that, because you can see just how much that can add to it. Now, another good example, again, of how much post-release support can grow a project is, of course, the game Payday 2, which they just wrapped up, I believe, their final Crime Fest event, which is their yearly event where they do a celebration, they release more content, and so on. But Payday 2 has released a lot, and I do mean a lot, of post-release support. They have had, let's see, according to this, they have had 50 pieces of DLC, which for a time was all purchasable, usually between, I think, $2.99 and $5.99, depending upon what it was. The majority of the DLC is now free, because of the fact they decided to just make the game free-to-play now. Or, I'm sorry, not free-to-play. They lowered the price down, and they released the Ultimate Bundle that includes a lot of other stuff. Yeah, it kind of got a little bit confusing in terms of the DLC there. But that, again, along with Team Fortress, shows that just what happens when you support a game that was already really popular it continues to grow that game and give it life. And for titles that aim to be games as a service or multiplayer, in today's market, it's not even a question anymore about whether or not you want to keep supporting it. You got to. You cannot release a multiplayer-driven game anymore, work on it for 3 months of post-release support, and say, we're done, but you guys keep playing it. It's never going to happen. And we're seeing this again with stuff like Rainbow Six Siege. Let's see. Of course, Call of Duty, Battlefield, and all those games. I wonder how Vermintide 2 is doing. Let's see. Looks like they just released an expansion in August for $10. 2 new levels. And a lot of people are not liking it. And that's interesting. They felt 2 levels, including quests and cosmetics, was not enough to warrant a $10 purchase. And again, this is where the DLC issue gets very tricky. Because if your DLC is $10, and most independent games are $10, it becomes that very weird situation of trying to compare apples to oranges. And even Payday ran into that situation at a $5 to $7 for their individual packs. And this again goes back to the idea of lifestyle games, where you're not meant to play it for 6 months and be done with it. You are playing this game, until you get completely sick of it. Warframe is a really good example of this. Warframe is microtransaction, I should say, heavy. And it is a major part of that game, and the fans love it. Because so much of Warframe is built on the additional content and new systems. I mean, I think they just added in like open world exploration to Warframe, which is insane to me. And I've been wanting to get those developers on. They have just not wanted to come on. Maybe I should keep bugging them. Let me see here. Yeah, they have just added in a new open world mode to that game. Does Steam have the same return policy on DLC? I do not know. Let me see. DLC purchase from the stores are fundable. DLCs are fundable. The only time it's been played. Okay, according to the Steam page about it, DLC is refundable up to 14 days on purchase, and if you've played the title for less than 2 hours since the DLC was purchased. So I guess it's that same 2-hour rule then. Yep. Yeah, something like Warframe, that is a complex game. And again, I know there are quite a few people, quite a few fans of mine who are very big into Warframe, and that's just an amazing game to study. But yeah, I know the same way about that, Desto, that I've tried to go back to some of those games like Payday 2, and I just find it too much to try and play. Like, for those of you who don't know, I have spent a lot of time in Payday 2. I've gotten, oh my god, I must have at least 300 to 400 achievements in that game at this point with all the stuff they've added. I've probably spent at least 100 hours playing Payday 2, but if I try to go back now, I have no way of trying to experience that game fresh. Without all the DLC, all the content, all that crazy stuff. And it just seems like way too much to try and jump back into. And I think that's always that challenge of lifestyle games. That if you leave those games and they just keep getting developed, it becomes harder, I think, to come back to that and realize not only am I back at zero, but I'm even a few steps before then because everybody's been playing all this new content. So I'm going to start a new game up, and I'm going to get, probably trolled and, flamed to hell People say, oh, why don't you do this and this and this? And there's no way to kind of ease a new player into that. It was one of the very big polarizing opinions behind Team Fortress that I know a lot of people that I've spoken to who don't like to play Team Fortress anymore because they find where Team Fortress is at now to be such a different experience to where it was at 1.0. Now, obviously, the changes to Team Fortress have secured its legacy and its lifespan. I mean, people are still playing Team Fortress 2 now than they were with the original 1.0. But you kind of lose that sense of magic, I feel. It's one of the things, and I've said this before, but I hate timed exclusive content. Because if you miss it, it always feels like you will never get to experience that stuff again. It was such a big turnoff for me with Hitman, which I know they're doing with Hitman 2 as well. I think they just released like an exclusive target with Sean Bean in that game now, which seems very apropos there. But it's one of those things that I always hate, the fact that if you release content that's, it will only be for 2 months and then will never be seen again, that again, it leaves the game feeling like a little hollow to me. And I just never really got into that kind of stuff. Now, let me see. I don't think Overwatch has gotten that far. I know they have seasonal stuff that comes back. But I doubt they would be crazy enough to do like once 1 month, get an exclusive skin and you'll never see it again. I think the fans will pretty much riot there. But let me see, what's our time? Jeez, I've been ranting for 40 minutes on this topic. We'll move on to our weird games segment in a section. I got one more topic to talk about. But I begin to wrap things up. When it comes to knowing when to stop working on a game, some games, again, really afford like an almost endless development. As long as people are still playing and willing to buy it, you could keep working on something like The Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, and of course Enter the Gungeon until, everybody has, gone mad. But the problem is that, one, it's a lot more risk in terms of continued profitability, and two, it becomes, I think, very soul-crushing to work on the same project day in and day out, and then you're always trying to kind of outdo the previous DLC. Now, with games like Payday 2, the developers went into that fully well knowing they were going to continue supporting that game and coming up with more ideas. And again, with games like that, the canvas is such that you can always keep expanding that. There's always a new gun you can add in Payday 2. Just like how in The Binding of Isaac, there's always some crazy new item, or, we can throw in a new modifier. But when we talk about heavy content, again, like XCOM 2, you really have to dedicate yourself to that. And then you run the risk, of course, of releasing DLC that people hate, because then you throw the opposite effect. You release something that people don't want, and then are they going to keep supporting you if they know that the base game may be here, but the DLC drags it down to here? And again, that's always the risk of more development, because you never know what's going to happen with some of this DLC. Payday 2 has had DLC marked down because people didn't like what was included in them. There was like a DLC that added a flamethrower. There was a DLC that added in a minigun and a rocket launcher into Payday 2, and that was crazy. And there's more to this discussion with lifestyle games, but I think we'll move on from here, because again, just talking to myself about this and you guys watching, it really drains your voice after a while. But I guess my final point for people watching this live and recorded about this continued content is, do you see it as a measure of quality? Like, what kind of DLC do you like to buy for a game? Because again, we can see all manner. Everybody remembers the infamous horse armor from Bethesda, and I'm sure with Fallout 76 they must have DLC planned unless things go horribly wrong, or if they continue to go horribly wrong, I should say. Alright, so they did say there was going to be DLC for it, but who knows what that means going forward. But when there's so much content being developed for these games, again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how hard it is to actually put a price tag on that kind of stuff.